Welcome to the Wednesday, March 30th Joint Food Ontology Workgroup discussion. And we got two presentations today on the theme of recipes and culture. And so welcome Andrea Borghini and Usashi Chatterjee. We'll start off with Andrea's presentation, which Andrea, I'll just let you take it from here.
Yeah, of course. Of course. I have some slides. Let me see. You should be able to view them now. And let me see if I do this, do you still view them? Wait. Okay. You do?
It's coming up. Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Great. So I'll just keep it, try to keep it as brief as possible. But of course, Damian, interrupt me if I go too long. So what I'm going to present here are just some research questions that I'm facing right now, myself, and then with some of the people that work with me. And just very briefly, okay, so I work in a philosophy department. I'm a philosopher by training in analytic ontology, what is called a metaphysics, some formal semantics, and then in philosophy of biology, and I work on food. I've been working on food for about 12, 13 years. And maybe if you think about food and philosophy, you might think about a more standard approach, the one that is most common, that addresses food issues through traditional philosophical questions, such as, questions regarding the pleasure and sufferance that we might inflict over animals or even plants, when we eat, or questions about, whether food cooking and dining can be regarded as art. Okay, but the type of issues that I'm going to discuss today are a bit different, and they're based on an approach that is, I would say, I don't know if more theoretical, but is also certainly more particularized. So it uses philosophy to rethink what often are specific food concepts or concepts relating to culinary cultures, to eating. So one way to do this is to do a conceptual analysis, and some of you may be familiar with this, like you take the idea of taste and you think, what is taste? And science today has given also to philosophers a lot of work, to rethink the idea of taste. And so you can really analyze more globally a certain concept, so the idea of taste, or you can do more tailored, targeted work, which is what is known today as conceptual amelioration or negotiation. So you take the use of concept in a specific domain, as it could be, for example, a formal ontology, or as it could be a certain food chain or a food system, and you try to improve that concept. Very famous examples are the concept of gender in a specific context, or the concept of race as used again in a specific context. So in a region, by a certain institution, you think of improving the ways in which gender adverbs, for example, are used within your own institution. And this is really what it could be called conceptual amelioration and sometimes negotiation. So some of these ideas could be related to, say, the concept of meat. I'm not gonna, spend more time on this, but just to give you very basic examples, are the idea of milk, and in different legal contexts, specific areas of discussion, conversation, or consumption, we may adopt different rules. And perhaps, you could include in the category also geographical indications, and certainly food labels, like the idea of local food, for example, how we should think about local food. But I'm not going to talk, of course, about any of these specific things now. The point is just to give you some examples and to say that when we are negotiating these things, one way to think about that is that we're negotiating our food ontology, so a form of reality. And one way to think about the negotiation, or some key questions, are about what are the space of negotiation? So what are the conceptual options? So if you have a concept, how you can expand it in different directions. So typically, if you can have a more realist idea of the concept, like what counts as milk, might be decided by, in that case, say a scientist that works in, I don't know, in biochemistry, or if there is space of negotiation also on another spectrum where you could think that there is more openness to alternative conceptions of what counts as milk. And so also there you have a spectrum that goes towards more common sense or towards scientific understanding. Okay. But so another really important question, if we are thinking about negotiating a concept, is who is involved, right, in negotiating a concept. So what kind of actors, sometimes you can even think of them as stakeholders, but not all of them need to be stakeholders, are involved. Not all of them may have the same type of expertise, and we have to discuss what is an expertise and so on and so forth. And which values do we want to prioritize in this discussion, okay? So this is for a very brief introduction. Let's talk also very briefly about recipes. Recipes are quite complicated items of culinary cultures. There is a lot of discussion recently about recipe. In a sense, I myself started this in 2015 in this paper, which followed up actually on other works, but this made the question more clear. And then here you have to the right, top right, for example, a special issue on the topic. So recipes give, they raise a lot of issues. One of them could be related to, very, very gut reactions that people might have. Here I just put as a petty example, these social media called Italians mad at food, where people get really angry about ways in which people, in which recipes get executed, by some people, and they post them online, and people don't like, of course, what they do, and they react like this. But there are also a number of other issues that we are not going to discuss now, but are really important. Like this article in the New York Times, it was from, I think, November of last year, I think made some really good points, by Priya Krishna, asking who owns a recipe and cases of plagiarism in cookbooks, where, as you probably know, recipes cannot be in their whole copyrighted. In general, there are no IPs on the overall recipe with, we can discuss specific examples, but certainly there are also ethical or professional issues surrounding them, okay? So in a book that was published recently, and this was part of the reason why we decided to do this presentation today, we raised a number of questions, and in a paper, in a chapter in that book, I raised these 7 philosophical questions, and today I wanted especially to focus on the third one, but it's connected to the first one. So the first question that I think could be of interest to this group is whether recipes are procedures or culinary items. And although this question might seem, I don't know, not immediately intuitively important, it's actually a crucial question. It's a problem that I got stuck with actually presenting some work on recipes a few years ago in Buffalo, where there are, as some people working in ontology, like Barry Smith himself, who insisted in saying that recipes are just procedures. And it seems to me that there is a step, it's a bold claim to think of a recipe just as a procedure, because recipes always contain a lot of implicit information that is not conveyed, or one could argue is not conveyable just in a procedure, because that procedure, again, might have a lot of implicit aspects that cannot be fully specified at least pragmatically in a procedure. And one of the big questions of that is a question that pertains, related to that is a question that is really here in number 3. So what kind of tools do we have available to ourselves to represent a recipe? Okay, and I hope the questions I'm going to ask now might make this a bit clearer. So think of yourself, you are working to improve automatic cooking. Okay, so you have to instruct a machine how to cook something. It could be paella, it could be a matriciana, it could be a cappuccino, anything, even something relatively simple. So you want to translate that recipe into a procedure, a specific procedure. And one way in which you can think about this, I believe, is an exercise in translation. You're taking a recipe that originally, if it's a traditional recipe, was couched in a specific language, and you're translating it into a language, specifically in a language of formal ontology that you're using, and you are trying to do that language of formal ontology, you're trying to have that language represent such procedure in a way that can somewhat standardize it for the machines, okay? And one of the really important aspects of using formal ontologies that I think it's a great advantage, but it also presents some difficulties or issues, important issues, is that in a way it can be seen as some sort of lingua franca, right? So it's almost, I don't want to say universal language, but it's almost like a more neutral language where a recipe that was couched in a specific, cultural context and linguistic context gets translated into formal ontology. And already in this process of translation, we may be losing really important information that is key, to tradition. So what I want to focus on here for a discussion, and what I want to raise are just some research questions that I'm investigating in this moment, are the following. Okay, so let's think about the principles of this operation of translating recipes from their traditional context into a formal ontology. So which theoretical and ethical principles should guide these efforts of recipe translation? Like, should it be, I don't know, transparency to the cost of, or simplicity to the cost of, maybe saving time, saving costs to the machine, to the cost of staying closer to what was the original recipe? Should it be, the market that we are translating it for, or other constraints that we might envisage? Another, I think, really important question that we have to ask is whether some individuals are better positioned than others in translating a recipe. So one thing I'm thinking here is that often when we do this work, even I'm thinking about, someone who's actually writing, the code, we might not always consult with people who are, you could say, experts in the sense of local experts. So it could be, anyone who's a good cook for their recipe, or who speaks a specific language, or who's used to eat their recipe. So people that can be seen as stakeholders in their recipe, and get insight from them with respect to how exactly to translate some specific aspects of the recipe. Okay, so this is something that we have to ask in order to individuate the actors that are best suited to consult the translation process. Okay, and another really important question is about standards. So whether now I was imagining traditional recipes as being homogeneous, but of course they aren't, right? And there are some recipes that are really much more intimate to certain groups than others. And we have to ask whether the standards of translation and what kind of principles we use might be specific to to how intimate those recipes could be to different groups. Okay, and another, the last research question or area that I think is really important to investigate is also what are the effects of translating a recipe into a formal ontology over certain groups, right? So take some very famous examples like food from the Andes that has been discussed quite a bit in literature in recent years. So you have communities in the Andes whose recipes became world famous, and they have been somewhat made extraneous to those recipes, according to some authors, because they really don't have any impact, any authority over all the restaurants around the world that cook those recipes. And one of the issues you could have is that you could easily, maybe today, start thinking about standardizing these recipes into automatic cooking. And so the issues here are, what kind of effects a widespread use of these recipes in automatic cooking could have over the cultural heritage of this group in terms of food culture heritage. Okay, so I'll stop here. I hope the questions are relatively clear. I know maybe I didn't go into, of course, many details. I just wanted to give the shout out to all the people at Culinary Mind that work with me. You know, I have daily lots of conversations with people about these issues. So I have to be thankful, of course, to all of them. And you know, here are just the contacts again, if you want to ask questions, also privately. Yep. Damian, back to you.
Great. Thanks, Andrea. I just love the way you frame up the issues, especially appealing to folks working within institutions to be aware of the terminology that they're active in. I open the floor to questions, folks. You have angles on this you'd like to pursue.
This is Diane, are there influences on, say, major food processors on reflecting a culture? Say if you've got a big food processor and they're making taco shells, is that influencing culture, or how does food processors fit in your view?
Diane, it's huge. Just think, you know, a famous case, I was at a talk a few weeks ago, and they were debating mayonnaise. And mayonnaise, I think today is pretty standard to find that in mayonnaise you never use olive oil. And that's because in food processors, if you use olive oil, it's going to heat up too much and then it's going to give a bad taste. And so the food processor changed the recipe. In a sense, it definitely is very rare today to find the mayonnaise where they used olive oil. And in the past, I'm not saying that everyone always used olive oil, but it could have been much easier to use it because you were having a different, a different, or I think in Italy we have pesto, you know, everybody now makes pesto, but usually we use a blender, and most people, it's not in the recipe, you know, to use a blender because again, it changes really the taste of the basil. So the processing can change in all sorts of ways. It can shorten the time, it can change the taste, it can change the ingredients, it changes the end profile, et cetera, right? And so one of the key issues is when we are developing the tools and they're specific to maybe make certain recipes, some of the questions we could ask is we could interrogate stakeholders of those recipes as to how they would think, what they would think would be the best way to even talk about, communicate how that tool could be used, incorporated into those cuisines. In the sense, I think changing cooking is normal, you know, it's really normal. But one thing that is not perhaps, it's really fast today, and one thing that we're not used to do or we haven't really understood yet is that by impacting the technology, we also impact communities. In some cases, we can impact recipes that are really intimate to some communities. So one thing that we could very easily do is just that in companies, as we do with many other things, we could have a standard procedure to ask, to consult with some stakeholders, even just through, I imagine many people would very happily just offer their opinion, you know, freely, but that could be really insightful because it comes from insiders, you know, of a recipe. And I hope this is relatively clear. Of course, I can go into more details.
And that triggers for me the notion that if you change the way tacos are made, if you go to the store to buy them instead of making them at home, suddenly you've changed the flavor of your neighborhood, because walking along the street, I could smell those tacos being cooked by somebody. And so that does have real implications. All right, we have some hands up. First off, I see Naomi. Go for it.
Yes, thank you very much. That was very interesting and thought-provoking. I wonder, has it been a problem with respect to intellectual property related to recipes? Because I would think that much of this information is really freely available and one has open access to. And if we get to the point where tweaking something that might have been called, say, pesto, to make it your own, that then somehow you're infringing on someone's rights, that's really taking us in the food domain, to me, perhaps down paths that we really don't want to go.
I agree. Yeah, no, I see. No, go ahead.
No, are there legal issues, legal ramifications that you're sort of suggesting?
There are, yes, they are huge, and they have to be investigated, I think, quite carefully. So it's not right, just the ownership. So if you come up with a new way to make pesto, right, you could copyright that if it's just a new procedure, and that's fairly standard, right? And it's okay. I think probably wouldn't be something new. I think here the main legal issue that I'm also hinting at is a legal issue that instead relates to the rights of of cultural heritage. So could you argue that a company who's making a machine to make tacos at home, right, or a pesto at home, they specifically, right, for making some of those items, is actually threatening the cultural heritage of a certain group? And could that group try to have legally retaliate against the company? I think this is a big question. It's a tricky, I think it's a tricky answer to go down that road, but it's certainly also not the only thing that I'm thinking about, right? I'm thinking that some of those methods might not need to be resolved from a legal standpoint, but they could be resolved also from an ethical standpoint, right? So the article from the New York Times that I cited before, I think it's interesting precisely because I think in the publishing world, it seems that many actors are not favorable to adding copyrights for recipe books, so for the recipes in recipe books, but they might be in favor of upping the ethical standards and professional standards, right? So that if you are publishing a book that is fundamentally copying off of another book without acknowledging it, which you actually can do from a copyright point of view, then you are not professionally doing a good job, So it's not a legal issue, but it becomes a professional and ethical issue. And I think also this could be something, again, that I'm suggesting about one way to think about the work of an ontologist or a company that develops a machine, for doing automatic cooking. You could think that the work is ethically questionable, not legally questionable, but ethically questionable, right? And so in the same way in which we might question a company for environmental dumping or social dumping, I don't know, what have you, in those terms, you could also similarly raise this type of questions. They are ethical, they're not legal, but they're really important. And I think most of us, I imagine, working with informal ontology, I put myself in, I'm very interested in formal ontology in food, and I was always in general, but it's, you don't want to do something that is unethical, and at least you're not onto this business to do. So I think it's just to make explicit the principles that we should use, how we should be aware of how our work impacts communities, and how we can try to avoid that by precisely asking, involving people. And this is trying to find procedures for that. I hope, Naomi, that's clear. So it's not only legal issues. I think there are also legal issues, but there are also ethical issues that I'm interested in investigating, ways of, finding remedies to them, or finding procedures that are better in them.
Thank you very much. I guess I personally have challenges with thinking that ethics is somehow governed by legality, because I would think that, if you have a cultural heritage, it's an advantage to be able to share it. And I don't think necessarily going down the path of thinking that someone, has proprietary ownership of something that may be, hundreds of years old, will take us down and probably fund lawyers forever. And, I don't know if that's the best direction to be headed for our societies.
Well, I might interject that that seems to draw the distinction. Maybe we can make the distinction between the right to name something a certain way versus the right to actually do it and replicate the recipe, naming it. So that's the appellation, the whole world of appellations. I think time for Matthew Lang to give one short question.
Yeah, well,
I'll
I'll just jump in on this conversation because I think it's actually really important. So I would actually counter Naomi's point to say, well, what about in the case when, for instance, PepsiCo sends in a team of, flavorists into somewhere in the Amazon or in some place that is not necessarily exposed to all the modern conveniences and technologies, and begins to an extractive process of not just resources but also recipes, and then tries to recapitulate them and claim that they're making something that's authentic that isn't actually authentic, and none of the proceeds from that go back to the culture itself. They go into the pockets of the PepsiCo executives. And so that to me is where we should begin to have ethical standards around this, because otherwise we're just setting ourselves up as a global population for this kind of extractive relationships between corporations and indigenous populations all around the world. And that to me is kind of frightening. I don't know what the answer is, but I'm glad Andrea's asking those questions. I do know that there are issues with in this business with recipes. I remember going to a conversation back when I was an undergrad in the 80s and hearing discussions about the fact that various Chinese cookbooks all had the same recipes in them, and why would they be publishing a new Chinese cookbook? So this issue has been around for a while, just changing a few things in the book and then republishing it with a different package. But now what I've noticed in playing with conversation agents and whatnot, what does it look like to be able to share a recipe on the web? And some websites cannot share another website's recipe. They can share parts of it. They can share the ingredients, share the procedures, as a for instance, but they can't share both the ingredients and the procedures. Otherwise, that's actually content that belongs to that other website. In a social media, I'm thinking of the various recipe websites here where people post their recipes and stuff like that. And so, but I would think that they would be those websites would be very interested in the questions that you're asking. And conversation agents too, like the Google Smart Speaker and things, when you ask it how to make a blueberry muffin or something, and you get an answer back.
Okay, short response, Andrea, before we move to
yeah, no, I
Usashi's.
just thank you. I mean, this is really interesting. The only thing maybe I can add is that I think it's really difficult to draw the line between precisely where the ethics should be and when the law should come in. I mean, we should make distinctions, like Damien, you were mentioning the naming, which is quite different from the procedure, right? So I imagine Naomi is thinking, well, if there is a society that has invented something really good, we should all be able to use it. And I agree with that. As much as I agree that also if that group is really happy to share the recipe, why not? Some people, and you can capitalize on that. It's called soft power and it's very well known. And it just depends on, I think, to discuss procedures and see that case by case is going to be really important. I agree that having very strong legal boundaries could really be a detriment to the sharing of of food knowledge around the world too, and that could also have an impact over all sorts of things, food security, safety, all sorts of stuff. So it's really important. But this is certainly an area that has more has to be discussed. Now that we understand, I think, a bit better also, or we reflect more about what recipes are. Until 20 years ago, we had very little of all of these. So, okay, thank you. Thanks again.
Great. Thanks a
Any
lot.
question you want to send me via email, I'll be happy to discuss.
Yes, well, if there is a little time at the very end, I'll just talk a little bit about the recipe model that Food On is trying to take on and where it can go with respect to what you've talked about. Usashi, love to hear your presentation about your recipe work.
Yeah. Hi, Damien. I'll try and share my screen and just let me know if you can see my screen.
Okay.
Can you see my screen?
It's coming up. Here we go. Yeah. Let's see we see the whole menu, the whole.
Could you please
PowerPoint.
confirm that you can see my notes?
We see the slide list and the main slide and the toolbar. So it's not in presentation mode yet.
So you can.
You see that context query understanding using knowledge model slide? It's in the context of your PowerPoint software. So we see all the menu.
Okay. Let me see. Okay, let me try and do it differently. How about now? Can you see my screen? The first
there you go.
slide.
Full panorama. That's great.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay. So hi everybody. I am Usashi, and thank you, Damien. Today we had an interesting discussion by Andrea, and I will try and bring in some of the things that he had discussed and some shout outs, and I will try to bring how they are related to my talks, and it actually blends well. So let us see how we can proceed. Briefly about me, I have a background. I did my BTech in computer science engineering in India, and then I did information science. And then I did my PhD in India, and now I'm a lecturer at Cardiff University. That's my journey. During my PhD, I did invest some time working on ontology, semantic web, and mostly I worked on the domain of food. And during my doctoral tenure, what I did was I proposed a core ontology, and this core ontology was proposed based on a principled approach that again was based on a list of canons and principles that were given by a mathematician and a librarian of India. So, Andreas, there is a work which is a principled approach to build ontology or domain knowledge. Okay. And today's talk is something that I published last year. This is a context-based understanding of food-related queries using a knowledge model, a culinary knowledge model. So to set our understanding right is if we are given a query, we are always interested to understand the semantics rather than the terms. So we need to identify the several concepts associated to a query. Okay. that's fine. And this has been the problem that the IR community, information resource retrieval community, they have been addressing fair and square. But what is the problem here? The problem is, firstly, we know that queries are usually short, they are ambiguous, and as Andrea had stated, he had set the floor right. If a query is influenced by culture, environmental factors, that may lead to multiple interpretations. So I gave a simple example here. For instance, tuna recipe. So tuna is a fish, and our Mexican colleagues, or many might be aware or unaware, that it is also a fruit, which is popular in Mexico. So if you are looking for tuna recipe, I might be interested in either or. So again, adding to the problem, when it comes to our domain which we are interested, the food domain, cultural diversity, it exists, and we do acknowledge that there is no homogeneity whatsoever between north, south, east, west, and the ability to understand a food related query for its context is always a challenge, because as Andrea rightly stated, that given a query, there are several components associated to a query. It can be the explicit components, it can have implicit components. And there is another component that I will talk about, is the hidden component that might not be there, and it leads to an expert's knowledge to identify the hidden facet. So the solution to address this problem, the solution that we have is to contextualize and analyze a query. It's important because it paves the way to towards the query intent, and it helps to find the meaning which fits in a way that a user will be able to understand. And the second is, what we did was we proposed a framework that would expose the different facets in a query and align the facets with the context-dependent knowledge model. So the task that we did here was query understanding. How do we do that? In order to do that, we tried to explore the explicit, implicit, and hidden facets of a query. And then what we did was we mapped those facets against a knowledge model. Now, there have been several instances where domain-specific assistance, it played an important role in information retrieval. And here is just some examples that I have provided, where there were use of thesaurus, domain-specific thesaurus, ontologies, dictionary-based approaches were undertaken for IR and related tasks. Okay, so I will not go into detail, but here I will discuss how we did with the knowledge model. What we did was we started collecting competency questions, and this has a relation when Andrea mentioned about translators, that they are the individuals who might have experience, they might have a background, they might have some knowledge based on the culture they have been, the way they have been raised, the environment, or many other aspects. So we did take into account that, and what I did was I collected questions from several people. And then what we did was we tried to identify some patterns and categories based on these competency questions. And then we realized that these categories should be there in our knowledge model. So what we did, we had one competency question, and then we framed it in the form of an SQL like framework, if I say. So if we are asked to for a recipe of roasted turkey for a Thanksgiving celebration, so we can select all recipes from a given dish for a particular event where the name is roasted turkey. So this way we were breaking the facets, and hence, so it is more like a bottom-up approach. And in course of time, this exercise helped us to identify the different facets of our knowledge model. Okay, so from here we could identify that there is a recipe required. User is looking for a recipe for a particular dish for a given event. And then the recipe name and the name of the event, the type of ingredient, the cooking method, all these things came in place. So this is the knowledge model. I don't want to go into the detail of this knowledge model, but I will spend some time in the interesting findings. There are some findings that I found particularly interesting, and it's up to the audience to decide whether they are generic or specific. So a student from Georgia, when I asked, I was collecting these competency questions, okay? And I asked them that if you visit a restaurant, what would you order? So she said she will order X, Y, Z. And then what she said that we do not order wines. And I was very curious, why? Then she told me that in her village, most of them, they have their own wine production. It's there in the culture. So they have, they have vineyards, and there is homemade wine. So why go and buy a wine from a restaurant? Interesting. A lecturer from Cyprus stated that they always go for late night dinners. Restaurants open at 7 and they are there until 10, 11, 12. And I was quite surprised, because in UK that is not the scenario unless it's a weekend. So then the lecturer stated that because this is a Mediterranean country, they always like to go for a swim, enjoy the sun, and then they go for late night dinners. In India, McDonald's, they do not have beef in their menu. Interesting. Unlike UK or other European countries, I assume it's this, there is beef in the menu in US as well as Canada. And then I realized that because majority of Indian population, they don't consume beef. That might be one of the business strategies that McDonald's had undertaken. Breakfast in France, they are often sweet and not savory. This was when I came to know this, it was quite a culture shock to me, because as an Indian, I would always have savory stuff in the morning as my breakfast. Sweet would come later after my perhaps lunch or in the evening, but definitely not for breakfast. And I could not find an answer to this. Maybe some of our friends will be able to educate me. What is in a name? I saw that crepe and dosa, they are quite similar, but they have different origins and they are enjoyed at different places. Similarly, dumplings and gujia. So again, they are quite similar in the way that they are made. Gujia, however, is very event specific. In India, gujia is made in the northern part of India, very popular during the Holi, that's the festival of color. That is when they celebrate with gujia and a glass of buttermilk. So these were some interesting findings that I had. I mean, I had listed a few. So from these findings, we move on to the query understanding part, and we have the user query, we have the knowledge model, we have tried to capture all the information that we had collected during when we performed the interview and we had enlisted the competency questions. So now we try to do is, from the user query, we try to map them to the knowledge model, and then we try to understand the query intent. So the knowledge model, it acts like a backbone for understanding, analysis, and refinement. And then this is a loop, it goes on. So as I stated, user queries they mostly contain a few words. So it is difficult, but it is important to analyze the query and identify the different facets, if possible, explicit, implicit, and hidden facets. And that is what we try to do in this work. So an explicit facet, which is usually explained in a query, recipe of an item, X. Very clear. So I'm looking for select recipe of that item from your database. Recipe DB, which is suppose the recipe database or the table. The implicit facet is one which is suggested by the query. There is no clear evidence of the facet, but it is left to our interpretations. So if I say I'm looking for a recipe of an item, but I'm allergic to something, that means I'm saying implicitly what I'm trying to say is I am looking for recipe of an item and I do not want to have an ingredient A as part of the recipe. So this is the implicit facet. And next, coming to the hidden facet. So a hidden facet by the computer science and information science community, we call it as a latent facet that may be hidden or absent. And it is, so I'll give you, so it is revealed only if we have enough domain knowledge. And in order to gain domain knowledge, this query understanding stage is crucial, and also why we want to interview, why we want to collect competency questions become relevant. So recipe of roasted turkey for Thanksgiving. If you are looking for a recipe of roasted turkey for Thanksgiving, so Thanksgiving, it is celebrated by preparing this particular dish, and it was popular. We can consider this is a North American cuisine. So employing our extensive diversity-aware knowledge base, we make an attempt to fill up the missing facets. And so now what we added was that the name of the cuisine is North American. You can think, I mean, the application, when we are trying to, say in YouTube, we are trying to watch a video and we are provided with a lot of related videos, and YouTube, they use their own algorithm. And I believe that there is an application to this, that how they interpret the hidden facets, which is not explained. And actually in artificial intelligence, the common sense knowledge, the concept of common sense knowledge is becoming very popular. It is very difficult to capture, but it is also about the hidden facet. Okay. So then what I did was something that I think it's very simple. We broke the composite terms to increase the expressivity. So roasted turkey, this is a derived composite term. It has two concepts, roasting and turkey. So these two components, again, one is talking about the cooking method, the other one is actually the ingredient. And then what we did, we obtained the kernel terms by omitting the stop words. So that helped us to derive the linguistic syntax. It is the syntax of words, that is the sequence in which the words are arranged in a sentence of a given domain. Okay, and then what we did was we tried to map each of the components that we had identified in this phase with the knowledge model. Okay, so the recipe is the context, roasted turkey is dish, roasting is cooking method. And then what we did was we identified the broader term. So if it is not for recipe, it is say for building a car, it's for an automobile industry, we have domain, product, technique, substance, event, geographic location. So this is the broader component. So then comes term standardization. What we did was using AgroVoc and Langworld to standardize the terms. It is important. We found turkey has 6 senses in AgroVoc. So turkey meat was more relevant here. And then what we did, we tried to compare this study with 3 other models, schema.org, BBC Food Ontology, and Recipe Ontology, how well their models work, how well they address the competency questions. What we found was there were certain concepts and components that are not covered by schema.org, like dish, event, and meal, and their properties. BBC Food Ontology do not cover meal and preparation time. However, we found Recipe Ontology does fairly well. One of the reasons why we found this is because Recipe Ontology was built using several other ontologies. So they took the advantage of other ontologies. They had several components like kitchen accessories, cooking process, etc. And our recipe model, it performed better than these 3 components. Okay. Now, part of the future work is food for thought, whether we can use Food On as a de facto standard for food-based information retrieval. The second aspect is that we cannot ignore the fact that there is diversity. And the idea is now to introduce a formal concept analysis, implement a multi-context system which attempts to address the heterogeneity of a knowledge model. And I briefly started some work on this, where we adopt the ideas and notions as I stated, and this would be a generic model such that it can capture the heterogeneity of a given domain. And an open problem is to evolve queries with partial domain knowledge. Whether that is feasible or not, I don't know, but this is an open problem. So with this brief discussion, I come to the end of my talk, and I will be happy to take up questions, and let me know if you have any comments.
Yes, I invite folks, open the floor to this. I have a question too, but thank you very much for that presentation. And it sort of finishes off with an invitation to deep dive into how to represent not just the recipe domain, but each of the other domains that it's actually bringing in, culturally, regional information, time of year of ingredient, all of these things play a role. Thanksgiving, the concept of something happening in fall, the end of harvest, offers a explosion of multi-domain concepts to bring in. So folks, I don't mind going past 9 a.m. To talk about this stuff, understanding those of you may have to leave. Questions for for our host. I mean, Usashi, our speaker.
Andrea, he has a question.
Andrea, yes.
Yeah. If there is time, thank you. I think this is great. So I just have, I think this relates to some also other research that I'm, I'm trying to do. One question I have is from the ontologies that you mentioned. I haven't seen any of them precisely having as a subcategory the group, the target group that will be cooking the recipe, or that if there is a certain, disconnected to the recipe. So if you put Thanksgiving turkey, really depend if we're talking about US Thanksgiving turkey, assuming, or Canadian Thanksgiving turkey, I'm not an expert, but depending on who's cooking it, it might have quite different spices and quite different flavor profiles. So, for example, in the search, I would say that an ontology should have that as a sub, as an item, as a specification item, in addition to time, location, some of the other things that. And here is one other idea that I think is, I don't know if it can come, is it seems that the ontologies are assuming that the same name of a recipe has the same, I would say, taxonomic level globally, but it's not always like that. So take a cookie in the US, there are cookies and biscuits. If you go into a pastry shop, in Italy, you don't have the distinction, right? So you drop, like you have a different, or if you take, pizza in the US, a pizza margherita, then you could have Chicago style, New York style, you have different styles, In Italy, you don't have that. So they don't belong to the same taxonomic level. And I would really like to see an ontology, when you do a query, reflect that, if possible, by retrieving implicit information.
Yeah. So to answer, there are 2 questions that you said when it comes to recipe and where is ingredient, right? So for me, because what you stated, that ingredient is also important. Event, geography, blah, 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 they are there, but where is the ingredient? So ingredient, according to me, recipe cannot be defined without ingredient and without the steps. So recipe, for me, I think there will be a difference in opinion, but that's all right. Recipe for me, it's a process which has a set of steps along with ingredients, and not just ingredients, it should also come with quantity. Okay, that only can build a recipe. So ingredient happens to be a property of recipe. So what I will do is I will share my slides, and then if you can see the knowledge model, ingredient is considered as a property. The second part, what you stated, it's true how things are different at a global and a local level. And that is what I'm talking about, a multi-context system, which is required. And I am trying to build a multi-context system using formal concept analysis, and I think that will allow us to do that. But it's a work in progress. I cannot say much unless I can prove something. So, yeah.
On that note, I would really encourage a greater relationship to the OBO Foundry, which is involved in very much the same questions about creating semantic context around any focal point of interest, whether it's a concept of age, of location, of food, of organism, of life stage, creating the terminology that pertains to that concept, and then bringing it into a particular domain objective, such as recipe making. I'm just going to quickly say, Food On would like to be a partner in trying to live up to the information requirements around this stuff. So we want to make sure we know biscuit in North America versus cookie, and we want to make sure that we can also accommodate the Italians to say that if somebody uses a reference to either of those things, they end up with one higher level term in Food On. I don't think we have it there. We just have analogs, and we have different IDs for those two concepts so that they can be discriminated, at least by text. It would be great to move it to the next level and say we're going to be able to pinpoint the cultures that those reference, but that gets into a curational load that's a bit beyond Food On. Any other questions for Usashi? If not, I'll finish with, thank you so much for that. I'm going to finish with 2 points that relate to what you've just discussed, and Andrea. One is that we pitched for ICPO 2022 in Michigan, Ann Arbor, Michigan. We pitched a food process ontology workshop around recipe so that we could spend half a day or a day working on all of this modeling and parsing, looking at the ontological parsing of information, of recipe information out there.
Yeah. I think that would be great. I mean, this would be a fantastic platform to collect as much information as we can and get some perspectives, because when Andrea mentioned about bias, it's sometimes intentional and unintentional. People, when we talk about Indian food, mostly I hear butter chicken. Butter chicken is not just one thing about India, but it's just because the community that reached different parts of the world had spread butter chicken. That's why we know about butter chicken. Yeah. So I think it will be a fantastic platform, and yeah, I'm looking forward to that event. Yeah.
Okay, great. There's also a call for papers. I'll just announce for the Joint Food Ontology Workgroup workshop in Sweden, in Europe, which I think you may have all seen a message about. I'll just close with a brief screen share of the paper that's been submitted and under review. And this is our model for what a recipe might look like. And what you'll see is that it has absolutely no cultural references or those other contextual bits and pieces that you guys have created an invitation to layer into this. So basically, we're looking at a food recipe that has an ingredient set, a device set, and an instruction set. And those things alone would just look a bit more like a shopping list if you just had the ingredients and the devices. The instruction set is the food process component, and you'll see that that's detailed at another level so far in the model, involving processes description that may involve amount of time consumed, the people, the participants or performers, and the ingredients having the technical stuff around how to measure them, but still being able to name an ingredient and then know that it's actually typical of harvest in the fall, and that's why it would show up in the Thanksgiving menu, pumpkin, squash, carrots, all of those kind of in the ground vegetables that bode winter storage. That kind of information is not present here, and in the whole cultural layer and the history behind in processes or devices or ingredients in their locale. So I think that the workshop in September will invite working on adding all of that kind of modeling. So that's what you've left as a challenge for me anyway on the Food On side to push forward. The paper's still under review, and so we're expecting once that's done that we can actually release those diagrams and models onto the food on site, and then try to push it towards all of these other needs, demands that folks have. And what I really appreciate is your competency questions, Usashi, because we haven't put any formal time into creating a framework or structure for those. So we'll be paying attention to your work closely there and invite you to participate directly in drilling it all. Okay, with that, thank you both. What a rich morning. And we'll see you in a month when Bernd will be presenting on his food ontology modeling at the University of Bremen next month.
Okay.
So thanks very much.
Thank you
Everyone,
all.
thank you. Thank
Bye.
you, Sharon. Ciao, Zash. Yes.
Bye.
Bye. Ciao.